Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about something that's super relevant to all of you out there, especially if you're in any kind of leadership position.
Yeah, those like everyday judgments that we have to make at work all the time.
Exactly.
Hiring performance reviews, giving people promotions, all that.
With a lot, right? Those decisions are so important. So we thought it'd be awesome to really dig into some research on how to actually improve the quality of those decisions, make better calls.
Absolutely. So we're going to be looking at this really insightful article from the Annual Review of Organizational Psychology and Organizational Behavior. It's called Improving Workplace Judgments by Reducing Noise. Lessons learned from a century of selection research.
Wow, a century of research. That's a lot to pull from.
There's a lot there, yeah.
Okay, so this article starts off with this super interesting story, actually.
Oh, yeah.
About a study from way back in the 1950s. And basically, these researchers, they found that a simple kitchen scale could predict whether a psychiatric patient would end up back in the hospital just as accurately as experienced therapists could.
That's fascinating.
I know, it's like, whoa, makes you think, right?
It really highlights just how inconsistent our judgments can be, even when we think we're being, really careful and thorough.
Totally.
What the study revealed is something called noise in judgment.
Noise.
Yeah. It's basically this unwanted variability that makes our judgments kind of unreliable and leads to inaccurate predictions and decisions.
So even those therapists, even the experts, they were susceptible to this noise, and that was impacting their decisions about patient care. It's kind of unsettling when you think about it.
For sure.
It's like even with our best intentions and our expertise, our judgments can still be all over the map, and that's separate from bias, which is a whole other can of worms.
It is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah.
You're right, though. It's distinct. So bias is like consistently leaning in one direction, while noise is being inconsistent, sometimes overestimating, sometimes underestimating. Imagine you have two hiring managers, and they're assessing the same candidate based on the same interview. One manager might misinterpret a candidate's nervousness as a lack of confidence.
Oh, yeah, I can see that.
Right? And they rule them out. But the other manager might perceive that same nervousness as enthusiasm and think they're a perfect fit.
Wow, that's a perfect example of how individual perceptions can really affect the hiring process.
Yeah.
And it's not even intentional, it's just how they're seeing it.
Right. These unintentional biases and inconsistencies can have a big impact.
So we've got these disagreements between people, but the article also talks about how we can even be inconsistent with our own past judgments.
Exactly. We often don't realize how much our own judgments can fluctuate.
Really?
Yeah. So there's disagreement noise, which is what we were just talking about.
Okay, different people, different opinions.
Right.
Got it.
Different people looking at the same information, coming to different conclusions. But then there's also occasion noise. And that's where even our own judgments might vary.
Interesting.
Depending on the day, our mood, even something as trivial as how much coffee we've had.
So basically, we all have good days and bad days, and that can affect our judgment.
Precisely.
Wow.
It's why finding strategies to minimize the impact of noise is so important.
And that is exactly what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're going to explore some research-backed strategies to reduce noise, especially in hiring, because that's where you can really clearly see if someone was a good hire or not, based on how they end up performing. But these insights, they really apply to any decision-making process.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating.
And we'll be drawing from a whole century of research.
Wow.
And personnel selection, so you'll walk away with some actionable insights you can use right away.
Okay, let's just define judgment really quick, because it's something we do all the time, but maybe you haven't really thought about deeply.
Yeah, good point. So judgment, basically, it's the process of evaluating information to form conclusions, to make decisions.
So weighing the evidence in our heads and coming to a decision.
Exactly.
And that's where those biases can sneak in. Those hidden little weights that tip the scales one way or the other.
Totally. Biases act like these invisible forces that influence our perceptions without us even realizing it.
Confirmation bias is a big one. I think we've all been guilty of that.
Oh, absolutely. We tend to favor information that already supports our existing beliefs, even if it might not be totally accurate or objective.
For sure. But this noise we're talking about, it's different, right? It's not about intentional bias. It's more about the inconsistencies we were discussing.
You're right. So while bias kind of consistently pulls us in one direction, noise makes our judgments unpredictable.
Okay, so it's sometimes you might view a candidate's assertiveness as a strength, and other times maybe you're in a bad mood or something and you see it as aggressive.
Exactly. That's a great example. Noise can make our perceptions really fluid and inconsistent.
I'm starting to see the distinction more clearly now. I bet a lot of people listening are realizing they've probably made some noisy judgments without even being aware of it.
It's very likely it's a really common phenomenon. The key is becoming aware of it and then finding ways to counteract it.
Okay, so the article talks a lot about intuition and how relying on your gut feelings can actually make this noise problem worse. But isn't there any value to intuition at all? Like, I've heard all those stories about experts making brilliant snap judgments based purely on their gut.
Oh, I know those stories are definitely compelling and it seems almost magical. But here's the thing. We have to understand that true expertise-driven intuition
Okay.
requires very specific conditions.
So it's not just like a magical power that some people have.
Not quite. It's more like it requires a predictable environment, tons of practice with clear feedback, and the ability to quickly recognize patterns. Think of chess masters.
Okay, yeah.
They can make these seemingly intuitive moves
Right.
because they've spent years studying the game, playing countless matches, and developing this deep understanding of the possibilities.
So their intuition is built on this huge foundation of experience.
Precisely. It's not just a random hunch. It's rooted in a vast amount of knowledge.
And those conditions don't really exist in most workplaces, right?
Right. Work settings are often a lot more complex and unpredictable.
Totally.
So relying solely on gut feelings, especially in hiring, can be pretty risky. It's really complex. There are tons of variables.
Yeah.
And you often have limited information at the candidates.
So even if a hiring manager has tons of experience and has interviewed hundreds of people, they can't just trust their gut because each candidate is different.
Exactly. Every situation is unique. You can't just apply a one-size-fits-all intuitive approach.
That makes a lot of sense. So this idea of thin slicing, where you can accurately judge someone based on a really brief interaction.
Like in that book, Blink.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of.
Well, while the concept is super interesting, the research suggests it doesn't really hold up in hiring.
So our gut feelings might feel right, but they're often way less reliable than we think.
Especially when we're making important workplace decisions.
So what about the holistic approach to hiring?
Oh, yeah. So that's the school of thought that says you should really focus on forming a complete impression of the candidate based on intuition.
So like seeing the whole person, not just their test scores or their answers to very specific interview questions.
Exactly. They believe you capture something with that overall intuitive sense that a more data-driven approach might miss.
Interesting. But does that actually work?
Well, the research actually suggests it doesn't. Studies consistently show that the holistic approach underperforms compared to more structured, data-driven methods.
So the data-driven approach wins out.
It seems to.
Okay, so if we shouldn't rely solely on our gut, what's the alternative? What can we do instead?
Well, there are actually some really effective strategies for reducing noise and improving our decision-making. And we're going to talk all about those.
Tell me more. What are these strategies?
One of the most powerful ones is something called structuring judgment, especially when it comes to hiring. And it's basically about breaking down that judgment process into smaller, more manageable steps.
So instead of having a very vague idea of what you're looking for, you actually define the specific skills, the traits, and the experiences that are absolutely essential for success in that role.
Exactly, you nailed it.
Yeah.
And then you actually develop interview questions and assessments that are directly related to those specific criteria. And what's interesting is that even a small amount of structure is way better than none. And as you add more structure, the accuracy of your judgments goes up significantly.
So the most structured interviews where every single candidate gets the same questions in the same order.
Those tend to perform the best.
Which makes sense. It's almost like an oral exam, a test, where the questions are designed to be objective and relevant to the job.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. So even taking small steps to structure your hiring process can make a big difference. And this applies to other decisions too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Any kind of judgment can benefit from this approach. Breaking it down, defining your criteria, and applying those criteria consistently.
This is great. I'm already getting some ideas for how I can use this in my own work. But what about situations where you have a whole group of people involved in the decision?
Yeah,
Like a hiring committee.
for sure.
How do you manage all those different perspectives?
That's a great question. And it brings us to this really important concept called aggregating judgments.
Aggregating judgment. Okay, so instead of having just one person making the call, you gather input from multiple sources, and then you combine those insights in a systematic way.
You got it. And research on forecasting shows that combining forecasts from different people actually leads to much more accurate predictions.
Interesting.
And it's the same with hiring. Using multiple interviewers and then combining their scores, for example, by simply averaging them leads to better decisions.
So more eyes on the problem can actually reduce noise and improve accuracy.
That's the idea. But there's a really important caveat here. The article stresses that those judgments have to be independent, meaning everyone has to come to their own conclusions without being swayed by the opinions of others. If everyone is just echoing each other, or if they're influenced by like a dominant personality in the group, then you're not really benefiting from that diversity of perspectives. You're just amplifying the existing noise.
So it's like an echo chamber instead of a true chorus of voices.
Exactly. You want those independent voices to be heard. A great example of this is assessment centers. They're often used for hiring managers and executives, and they involve these simulations and exercises designed to assess leadership skills.
They sound pretty intense.
They can be, yeah. And one common practice in these assessment centers is for the assessors to reach a consensus on each candidate. So they observe the candidate, they rate them on different dimensions, and then they all get together and discuss and try to agree on a final judgment.
It seems like a good idea, right? Trying to get everyone on the same page.
It does seem like a good idea in theory.
But it's not.
Unfortunately, research suggests that this consensus judgment, which is often called the overall assessment rating, or OAR, can actually reduce the accuracy of the assessment center.
Wait, really? How is that possible?
Well, it all comes back to the issue of independence.
Oh, I see.
The process of reaching consensus can actually introduce bias and reduce the independence of those initial judgments.
Right, because people might be swayed by others, especially if there's someone in the group who's really persuasive, or if there's a lot of pressure to conform.
Exactly. And when those judgments are no longer independent, the benefits of aggregation completely disappear.
So what can you do about that? Like, how do you prevent that from happening in assessment centers or any situation where you've got multiple evaluators?
The key is to make sure those initial judgments are made independently, before any group discussion or any attempt to reach a consensus.
So each person observes and rates the candidate on their own without talking to anyone else first.
Exactly. And then once they've done that independently, then you can combine those ratings in a structured way, like by averaging them.
That makes so much sense. You're harnessing the benefits of structure and aggregation,
Right.
but also protecting the independence of those initial judgments.
Precisely. You're leveraging the wisdom of the crowd, but doing it in a way that minimizes noise and bias.
This is really eye-opening. I'm already thinking differently about how I approach decisions.
So we've been talking a lot about reducing noise, like from the evaluator's perspective, right? But there's actually another source of noise that we haven't really talked about yet, and that's the applicants themselves.
Oh, that's interesting. What do you mean applicant noise?
Well, even with the most structured assessment process in the world, the candidates themselves can introduce variability into the process that has nothing to do with their actual abilities or suitability for the job.
Okay, so even if you have the perfect interview questions and a really rigorous scoring system,
Right.
there are still some unpredictable things that can come up and maybe skew the results.
Absolutely. You know, some people are just naturally better at taking tests or
Yeah.
presenting themselves well in interviews, regardless of their actual skills and knowledge.
It's like they're unintentionally gaming the system somehow. Like their personality or their test-taking skills give them an advantage that might not even be relevant to the job itself.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are things like just the candidate's mood or energy level on that particular day, which can obviously fluctuate. You know, someone could have a bad night's sleep or they could be super nervous, and it affects how they come across, even if they're actually the ideal candidate on paper.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like that kind of noise is almost impossible to control. Like even with a perfectly designed hiring process, you can't control how a candidate is feeling on that particular day.
You're right. And the article actually acknowledges that this is an area where more research is needed. You know, we need to figure out better ways to either minimize applicant noise or at least account for it in our judgments.
Are there any kind of promising directions that researchers are looking at right now to address this?
Yeah, there are a few. Some researchers are exploring the idea of giving candidates the interview questions in advance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I feel like the traditional thinking is that you want to keep the questions a secret.
Right. You want to avoid having people over-prepare or rehearse their answers.
Yeah, exactly. But I guess the idea here is that by giving everyone the questions beforehand, You take away that element of surprise and allow people to really focus on demonstrating their knowledge and skills rather than like scrambling to remember what they were asked.
Exactly. And it might help reduce anxiety for people who tend to get really flustered in interviews.
That's a good point. It seems like there's a trade-off there, right?
Yeah.
Like you might sacrifice some spontaneity in the interview, but you might gain a more accurate sense of the person's true abilities.
Exactly. It's a balancing act.
Okay, cool. What else are they looking at?
Another area of research is looking at those asynchronous video interviews.
Oh yeah, those are becoming more and more common.
They are. And one of the potential benefits is that it allows the candidate to record their answers when they're feeling their best.
Right, they can do it on their own time.
Exactly. They can take breaks. They can re-record answers they're not happy with and basically try to minimize the impact of those day-to-day fluctuations that we were just talking about.
That's really interesting. It gives them a lot more control over the process and allows them to present a more like authentic and polished representation of themselves.
That's the hope. But of course, we need more research to really see how effective these strategies are in practice.
For sure. Now, even with all these great strategies for reducing noise, there's still the challenge of getting people to actually use them.
Yeah.
I mean, change is hard.
It is.
And when you're talking about something as personal as judging other people, there's bound to be some resistance.
Absolutely. And the article actually talks about this issue of user resistance. A lot of times people are hesitant to adopt these methods, even when there's clear evidence that they're more effective.
So what's behind this resistance? Why are people so reluctant to try these more structured approaches?
Well, there are a few factors at play. One is just this natural human desire to feel competent and skilled in our work.
Right.
Following a script or relying on algorithms can make people feel like they're not using their expertise or judgment.
I can definitely see that. It's like if you're just plugging numbers into a formula, anyone could do your job.
Exactly, and that can be especially true for people in positions of authority,
Right.
like managers and executives who are used to trusting their gut instincts and making calls based on their experience.
Yeah, it can feel like a bit of an ego blow.
It can, and there's actually research to support this. There was a study where they found that physicians felt less competent when they used a computer-aided diagnostic tool, even though it actually improved their accuracy.
That's so interesting. It's almost like there's this psychological barrier to letting go of control, even when it might lead to better results.
That's exactly it. And the same pattern shows up in hiring. Studies have shown that hiring managers tend to perceive structured interviews as less valid,
Really?
even though the data suggests they actually lead to better hiring decisions.
It's almost like we're clinging to those familiar ways of doing things,
Yeah.
even when we know they're not the best.
Yeah, it's a human tendency for sure.
So how do you overcome that resistance? How do you get people on board with these more structured approaches?
Well, the article points to a few promising areas of research. One is just providing people with clear evidence of the benefits. Show them the data, the studies, the real-world success stories.
Appeal to their logic and reason.
Exactly. Another strategy is to involve people in the design and implementation of these approaches.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and give them a sense of ownership and control over the process.
Right, so it doesn't feel like something that's being imposed on them from above.
Exactly. And then finally, it's important to just address people's concerns and anxieties, listen to their feedback, acknowledge their feelings, and really help them understand that these approaches aren't about replacing human judgment. They're about enhancing it.
It's about communication and empathy and building trust.
Exactly. It's about helping people see that these structured approaches aren't a threat. They're actually a tool that can help them do their jobs better.
I love that. Okay, now I have to ask about algorithms.
Sure.
We hear so much these days about AI and machine learning taking over, and that includes hiring decisions.
For sure.
So where do algorithms fit into this whole conversation about noise reduction?
That's a great question, and one that's often misunderstood. Algorithms, when used correctly, can be incredibly powerful for reducing noise and improving judgment accuracy. But it's important to clarify what we mean by algorithm because it can be something really simple. It doesn't have to be some fancy AI system.
Right, it's not just about like those complex AI systems that are predicting your personality or future success based on your social media posts or whatever.
Exactly. At its core, an algorithm is really just a systematic process for producing an answer,
Okay.
often involving a formula formula or a calculation.
So it could be as simple as averaging a set of ratings.
Exactly. Or it could be more complex, like a statistical model that integrates a bunch of factors to make a prediction.
Like the formula for calculating your credit score,
Yeah.
or the algorithms that Netflix uses to recommend movies.
Perfect examples.
Hmm.
And in hiring, well-designed algorithms can be fantastic noise reducers because they help us combine information from different sources in a really consistent and objective way. And that minimizes the impact of those individual biases and inconsistencies that we've been talking about.
So in a way, algorithms can help us overcome our own human limitations.
In a sense, yes. But here's where things get a little tricky. The term algorithm has become a bit of a buzzword.
It has.
And it's often used to describe any kind of complex AI or machine learning system. While these AI and machine learning approaches definitely hold promise,
Yeah.
they can actually introduce a whole new level of noise if they're not designed and used very carefully.
So just because something is labeled AI doesn't automatically make it superior or accurate?
Exactly. In fact, these complex systems can sometimes even amplify existing biases if they're trained on data that's already biased.
Right, like that example with Amazon,
Oh, yeah.
where their AI hiring tool ended up discriminating against women because it was trained on data that reflected biased hiring decisions from the past.
Exactly. And that really highlights the importance of making sure that any AI system used in hiring is grounded in a solid understanding of the job and the factors that actually predict success in that job.
So it's not about blindly trusting AI. It's about using it thoughtfully within a well-designed ethical framework.
You got it. And the article actually outlines 4 essential steps for making accurate hiring judgments.
Let's hear them.
The first step is identifying the specific requirements of the job.
Okay, makes sense.
The second step is figuring out what knowledge, skills, behaviors, and traits are actually associated with success in meeting those requirements.
Okay, so what does it actually take to be good at this job?
Exactly.
Okay.
The third step is selecting standardized methods for assessing those qualities.
So like choosing the right tests, the right interview question.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. What's the fourth step?
The fourth step is combining those assessments in a way that's consistently job relevant. And algorithms should really be used primarily in that last step, combining the assessments, rather than as a shortcut that bypasses the whole process.
So it's not about replacing human judgment with AI.
Right.
It's about using AI to augment and refine human judgment.
You nailed it.
I like that.
Yeah.
But I think it's also important to remember that even the most advanced algorithms aren't perfect.
Oh, for sure. They're based on data. And data can be flawed or incomplete or biased.
Absolutely.
So we always need to maintain a critical perspective even when we're using sophisticated tools.
We can't just blindly trust the output of an algorithm. We have to understand how it works, what data it's based on, what its limitations are.
Exactly.
This has been incredibly enlightening. I'm learning so much about making better decisions. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive into reducing noise in workplace judgments. We talked about how noise is different from bias, the limitations of relying too much on intuition, the power of structure and aggregation, and even those tricky areas like applicant noise and user resistance.
It's been quite a journey through the research, and I think this article we've been discussing really does a fantastic job of summarizing over a century of findings on personnel selection. It gives us some really valuable insights that we can apply to all kinds of decisions, not just hiring.
Absolutely, so much to think about. But if we had to boil it all down to like one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Reducing noise is absolutely crucial for improving workplace judgments. No matter what kind of decision you're making, whether it's hiring, promoting, evaluating performance, or anything else where you need to be accurate and fair, minimizing noise should be at the top of your mind.
Okay, that's a powerful statement. I've talked about some strategies for doing that. What would you say are the most practical and effective ones that people can start using right away?
Well, we've touched on several, but I think it's worth emphasizing them again. First, structure. Structure. Breaking down those complex judgments into smaller, more manageable steps with clear criteria and standards for each step is so important. And using standardized procedures and tools whenever possible can really make a big difference. Second, embrace aggregation. Combining multiple independent evaluations is a really powerful way to get a more accurate overall assessment. But remember, the key here is independence. You really want to avoid groupthink and make sure that each person is making their assessment without being swayed by the opinions of others. And third, don't rely solely on intuition. While gut feelings can sometimes be helpful, they're often unreliable, especially in complex, high-stakes situations. So whenever possible, try to ground your judgments in data and evidence.
Such great advice. And again, it applies to any decision we make, not just in the workplace, but in our personal lives too.
Exactly. These principles are broadly applicable anytime accuracy and reliability are important.
I think for a lot of people, the biggest hurdle will be overcoming that resistance to change. It's tough to let go of old habits, especially when they're comfortable and familiar.
That's true. It's a common challenge. But I think it helps to reframe how we think about these structured approaches. Instead of viewing them as constraints or limitations, think of them as tools that can actually enhance our effectiveness. They can free us from the burden of purely subjective judgments. They can reduce the risk of bias and error, and they can ultimately lead to more equitable and accurate decisions.
I love that. It's not about getting rid of human judgment altogether. It's about using these tools to make our judgments sharper and more informed.
Precisely. And it's also important to keep in mind that decision-making is inherently probabilistic. Even with the best methods in place, we won't be right 100% of the time. There's always going to be some degree of uncertainty and the possibility of making a mistake.
So we need to accept that reality and focus on reducing the sources of error that we can control, like noise.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so valuable. It gives us concrete strategies and tools to minimize noise and improve the accuracy of our judgments, even when we're operating in a world of uncertainty.
Amazing. To wrap things up, I'd love to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question as they go about their week.
I like that idea. How about this? How can you apply these noise reduction principles to your own decision-making processes? And I don't just mean at work. Think about the decisions you make every day, both big and small. Could you introduce more structure? Could you aggregate more viewpoints? Could you challenge your own intuitive assumptions?
That's such a great question. I hope this inspires everyone listening to think more critically about how they approach decisions and how they can reduce the impact of noise in their own work and lives.
Me too. Because even small adjustments can have a big impact, leading to better judgments and better outcomes for everyone involved.
Oh, couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this fascinating deep dive. It's been a pleasure as always. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.